Just after Japan dropped the first bomb on Pearl Harbor, the US command sent a radio message to all forces at sea. Some thought the intense shaking and deafening roar that filled Pearl Harbor was just an earthquake. Others thought it was a training exercise. Why was the US military, one of the most powerful in the world, unable to properly defend against Japan's attack? The truth is, the US could have stopped the Japanese assault, but they missed a crucial signal. A massive war triggered by a single small mistake. Let us take a closer look at the attack on Pearl Harbor. What was the first thing the Japanese forces saw as they approached the skies over Pearl Harbor? There were a few civilian aircraft leisurely flying nearby, but not a single US military aircraft was in the air. At Wheeler, Hickam, and Bellows fields, the American fighter planes were grounded with their wings locked and chained together. The same was true for the Navy aircraft. Moreover, out of the 780 anti-aircraft guns on the naval ships at Pearl Harbor, about 3/4 were completely unmanned, guns without anyone to fire them. Only 4 out of 31 anti-aircraft positions were in any state of readiness, and even those were not loaded with live ammunition. After training, the ammo had been returned to storage. Why? Because keeping the ammunition loaded could lead to disorganization or damage, purely for maintenance reasons. As a result, the air defenses over Pearl Harbor were virtually empty. But why was the US military so unprepared? In truth, the US did expect Japan to launch an attack somewhere in the Pacific, but they never imagined the target would be Pearl Harbor. At the time, the US believed the most likely target for a Japanese attack was the Philippines. At the time, the United States had powerful naval and ground forces stationed in the Pacific. Out of 102 battleships, 2/3 were anchored at Pearl Harbor, and more than 500 military aircraft were stationed at nearby airfields. Among them were B-24 bombers with a range of up to 2,400 kilometers. There were over 1,000 anti-aircraft guns on land and aboard ships, and about 40,000 Army troops were stationed in the area. Perhaps because of this strength, the US let its guard down, thinking, would Japan really dare to fight us? It's all just bluff. As a result, most of the US military's attention was focused on the southern Pacific. Meanwhile, the Japanese fleet approached from the north. At that time, the US had what was considered the most advanced reconnaissance aircraft in the world, the Catalina patrol plane. But most of those planes were scouting the southern seas. In fact, before the attack on Pearl Harbor, the United States had several chances to realize Japan's true intentions by intercepting Japanese communications. One such opportunity came just before the attack, when a message was sent from Tokyo to the Japanese consulate in Honolulu. The message said, "Given the current situation, information about ships at anchor, battleships, aircraft carriers, cruisers is extremely important. Report every day to the best of your ability. Use the telegraph to inform us whether there are any signs of air defense balloons over Pearl Harbor and whether torpedo nets have been installed on the battleships." To anyone reading it, this message was an obvious warning sign of an attack on Pearl Harbor. It was intercepted in Hawaii and forwarded to codebreakers in Washington, D.C. for decryption. However, since it was related to Hawaii and seemed to have nothing to do with diplomacy, it was deprioritized. In September, an intercepted message revealed that Japan had divided Pearl Harbor into 5 sub-areas. However, the Army's intelligence chief dismissed it as a naval matter unrelated to the Army, and the head of the Navy's translation division reviewed the message but concluded it wasn't urgent. He assumed it was simply the Japanese Foreign Ministry trying to simplify communications. Around the time, Admiral Nagumo's fleet, assigned to attack Pearl Harbor, began heading south across the Pacific. Army Chief of Staff George Marshall and Chief of Naval Operations Harold Stark reported to President Roosevelt that Japan's likely target was Thailand and Southeast Asia, and that the main Japanese forces were still in Japanese waters. Meanwhile, the Tatsutamaru, a Japanese passenger ship assigned to evacuate Japanese nationals from the US, left Yokosuka on December the 2nd, heading for Honolulu, with plans to depart the US and return to Japan on December 14th. Because of this, US authorities believed that even if war broke out, it would not happen before December 14th. The day before the Pearl Harbor attack, Washington received a detailed report from the British Navy, stating that a Japanese fleet consisting of 35 transport ships, 8 cruisers, and 20 destroyers was moving toward the Malay Peninsula. But the US interpreted this as Japan preparing to attack British colonies, not themselves. Of course, the United States did send out telegrams to all forces in the Pacific, warning them to prepare for war. At Pearl Harbor, the naval forces were under the command of Admiral Husband Kimmel, whom President Roosevelt had praised as one of the greatest naval strategists of his time. However, even Admiral Kimmel did not believe Pearl Harbor would be Japan's target. Instead, he prepared to support other areas Japan might attack by fully fueling the fleet, and gathering all aircraft in the center of the airfield, ready to take off at any time. Ironically, this very preparation made the damage far worse when the attack came. The reason the US military never believed Japan would target Pearl Harbor was because it was located thousands of kilometers away from any mainland, making it easy to detect approaching enemies. Geographically, Pearl Harbor was considered a perfectly defensible naval base. The water was shallow, making torpedo attacks ineffective with the technology of that time. It was a massive naval base, fully equipped with airfields, port facilities, and fuel storage tanks. To launch an attack on such a large-scale base would require an enormous fleet to move into position, and the US believed that such an operation would be impossible. In fact, before the attack, the Japanese air raid group was detected on US radar. However, radar technology had just recently been introduced, and the operators weren't yet fully familiar with it. As a result, they mistakenly assumed it was a group of friendly bombers from the US mainland, and no action was taken. Despite all these signals, the US military failed to anticipate the attack on Pearl Harbor and was unable to mount a proper defense. It was Sunday, December 7th, and that morning, radio stations in Honolulu, Hawaii were playing cheerful jazz music. Only a few of the Pacific Fleet soldiers were having breakfast, and the entire island of Oahu was soaked in a relaxed holiday atmosphere. The fleet was docked in Pearl Harbor in neat formation, just like any other day. Aircraft were also parked side by side on the airfields across Oahu. When a large group of Japanese planes flew overhead, the US forces mistook it for a training drill. One soldier, who was raising the US flag at the barracks, even waved and saluted as the planes dived down from the sky. As the Japanese attack began, massive plumes of water shot up across Oahu and flames erupted throughout the island. It wasn't until 8 a.m. that the first alarm sounded. Air raid on Pearl Harbor, this is not a drill. But the attack on Pearl Harbor was not a complete victory for Japan. The main objective of the surprise attack wasn't just to destroy the battleships docked at Pearl Harbor. Japan's true goal was to render the US Pacific Fleet inoperable for at least a year. To do that, they needed to achieve two things. First, eliminate the aircraft carriers. And second, destroy the base's operational facilities, especially the fuel storage tanks. But they failed to do either. Instead, they made a critical mistake by only focusing on the ships currently docked in the harbor. The most important targets were the aircraft carriers. But the US's most famous carriers, the Enterprise and Lexington, were not in the harbor at the time of the attack. Just days before the assault, they had left Pearl Harbor on a mission. And that mission? A rather humiliating one. They were tasked with delivering fighter planes to US Marine bases. Aircraft carriers were the best option for transporting fighters, and that's why they were out at sea during the attack. The aircraft carriers reportedly felt pretty insulted. They were like, "What are we, cargo ships? Why are we doing delivery runs?" But what could they do? They were ordered to transport planes, so off they went on a humiliating delivery mission. Meanwhile, the Saratoga was on its way to another base, San Diego, for maintenance. So by the time the Japanese strike fleet reached its attack position, they received a report. There are no aircraft carriers in Pearl Harbor. That was the moment when they needed to make a critical decision. Should they cancel the attack? Or just go ahead and stick to the original plan, hoping for the best? In the end, they went through with the attack as planned. The two attack waves were carried out with precision and appeared to be a great success. However, even after the successful strikes, some of the frontline Japanese commanders and Air Force leaders insisted that they should bomb the oil tanks and logistics facilities next. But Vice Admiral Nagumo, the commander of the attack fleet, refused. This decision has been heavily criticized to this day. Nagumo had never commanded an aircraft carrier fleet before. This was his first time. According to records, even the day before arriving at Pearl Harbor, he remained deeply uneasy and uncertain about the mission. Whether this attack succeeded or failed would determine the outcome of the war. But there's something important to remember here. Rommel once said, "A commander must be optimistic." That doesn't mean making a rough plan and just saying it'll all work out somehow. They say war is like a fog, the fog of war. Once a battle begins, it's as if everything is buried in that fog. That's exactly why thorough preparation is essential before the operation begins. And once the fighting starts and uncertainty takes over, the commander must use every ounce of judgment to make the best possible decisions. In that sense, a commander must be optimistic. But Nagumo was constantly gripped by anxiety. When the critical moment came, instead of taking a bold step forward, he made a passive decision. Let's not take any more risks. So even though Japan succeeded in the first and second waves of attacks, they failed to realize a crucial fact. As long as the oil tanks and logistics bases were left intact and the American aircraft carriers had survived, the US Pacific Fleet could eventually recover. So what would it have meant if Japan had managed to destroy the American carriers? Even with America's incredible industrial capacity, aircraft carriers were not something that could be replaced overnight. At the time, Japan's overall strategy had two major objectives. First, if they could launch a surprise attack and destroy the US Pacific Fleet, it would take at least a year for America to recover. During that time, Japan planned to rapidly occupy key territories across the Pacific. Of particular importance were Indonesia and Malaysia, because they were rich in strategic resources like oil, rubber, and tin. Japan intended to swiftly take control of Indonesia and establish defensive bases there. They believed that if they fortified key islands and territories in the Pacific, even if the US counterattacked, those strongholds would never fall. At that point, Japan's naval power was already superior to that of the US. So, if America hesitated to strike back, Japan believed they could negotiate from a position of strength and take control of the entire Pacific region. However, in the end, because they failed to destroy the American aircraft carriers or port facilities, the Pearl Harbor attack ultimately turned out to be a complete strategic failure. The US carriers that Japan missed that day would eventually come back to haunt the Japanese Navy. In the United States, Japan's bold and deliberate attack had the opposite effect of what Japan had hoped. It united the American people more than ever. President Franklin D. Roosevelt, who had previously promised to keep the US out of the war, broke that promise, declaring December 7th a day of infamy and officially announcing a state of war with Japan. A few days later, Hitler declared war on the United States, pulling America out of neutrality and into full-scale involvement in World War II. In the end, Pearl Harbor did not cripple the US Pacific Fleet as Japan had intended. Instead, it awakened the sleeping giant, giving it the reason and resolve to enter the war. Why did a small island nation in East Asia, Japan, launch such a ruthless attack against a giant like the United States? What was Japan trying to achieve in the Pacific War, a conflict that would become a major part of World War II? To understand this, we need to go further back in time, to trace how Japan was able to expand its influence across the Pacific and Southeast Asia, and how it came to launch the Pearl Harbor attack that ignited the Pacific War. We will uncover those stories one by one in the coming chapters. Japan's surprise attack on the US naval base at Pearl Harbor, without a formal declaration of war, marked the beginning of hostilities with the United States. It was an unexpected strike that would change the course of World War II and begin the Pacific War. Why did the island nation of Japan push so far into the middle of the Pacific? And how thoroughly did Japan prepare to strike the United States? Let us now begin to uncover the whole truth.